First presenter today is Marinda Kotzé, who is a research psychologist, as well as the founder and executive director of Kaninzi Research Consulting. She recently completed her PhD in psychology at the University of Pretoria on the use of psychological theories in the South African HIV literature. Prior to founding Kaninzi, Marinda worked as a clinical researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and as a researcher at the South African Medical Research Council. And she's worked on a wide spectrum of research topics, including child health and safety, sexual violence, and the psychosocial treatment of complex trauma, with the majority of her work being centered around the behavioral and social aspects of HIV and AIDS and the evaluation of behavioral programs that aim to prevent the spread of HIV. So she'll be speaking with us today about the role of theory in our increasingly data-driven world, a systematic analysis of trends in South African behavioral research. Welcome, Marinda, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very honored to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to share my research with you today. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to share with you my doctoral research that I completed at the end of last year. Let's see if the slide changed. I'm going to share with you my doctoral research that I completed last year. I studied the use of theory in the social and behavioral study of HIV, specifically in the South African literature, going back all the way to 1982 to 2020. I'm going to start off by just giving a little bit of a background around theory usage and how that is studied. I'm going to define theory quickly so we know what we're talking about. Then I'm going to quickly give you an overview of my theoretical point of departure and my methodology. And then I'm going to get into the interesting stuff, the findings. I'm going to discuss the visibility of theory in the literature. I'm going to highlight the most common paradigms that were noted in the literature, highlighting some potential paradigm shifts. And I'm going to close with some noteworthy observations about theory use in the literature. So the question has to be asked, why study theory use? Psychology is often criticized for being phenomenon-driven and data-driven and not enough theory. Often when we discuss ways in which to strengthen psychology and the behavioral sciences, we talk about how to improve our methods and our data analysis techniques, how to regulate research and publication processes. And less often do we talk about theory and philosophy. Why methodological rigor and data analysis innovation is certainly very important, but I'm concerned that an overemphasis on the importance of methods and data might lead to the underappreciation of the complexity and the uncertainty in the real world and the phenomena that we study. We run the risk of collecting a lot of data about different study populations. It helps us describe the phenomena, but it leaves us with shallow information. We don't know how to connect that to the real world, how to make sense of that to get a deeper understanding of the phenomenon. So we need theory in order to make sense of our empirical observations. Now, reviews of studies that have reviewed theory use is not very common, but those that have been done on the HIV literature and the health and social behavioral literature has found that theories are used, but they're not necessarily used explicitly. So sometimes they're used implicitly and vaguely. They're not always used consistently. They're sometimes only used at the beginning of a study or retrospectively, but not throughout. And sometimes they're not even used correctly. So the poor use of theory is problematic. It suggests to me and to others that there might be a more significant problem in psychology and in the behavioral sciences, and that is the lack of critical and meta-theoretically reflective theorizing. Theories are used without scrutiny, without skepticism, without critically evaluating them and the assumptions that they are based on. The unreflective use of theory is particularly concerning because theories serves as the framework and they serve as the implicit assumptions that we carry into all of our work. It informs our choice of research topic, our choice of research method, our intervention strategies, how we interpret our data, and so forth. If we're not cognizant of the underlying philosophical and theoretical assumptions that shape our views, we no longer see how theory influences our perceptions and our interpretations of the world. This renders us, as social scientists, unable to distinguish between our observations and how the theories are altering our observations, potentially. So hence, I believe that studying theory use is a worthwhile pursuit. I think it's important to clarify what we mean by the term theory and the related terms that that's often used alongside theory. This diagram is meant to be a ladder of abstraction almost to show the types of theories that are more abstract, more general, less detailed, going all the way down to the more specific, detailed, more concrete conceptualizations. So meta-theories are high-level descriptions of ontology, of epistemology. They create the socio-historical context wherein theories and methods can be developed. Paradigms are intellectual homes that share the same foundational assumptions about a phenomenon and how it should be studied. Theory is a set of statements about the relationships between specific variables in order for us to describe, explain, predict, and even change and intervene. Models and frameworks can often be a bit confusing. I would explain them as referring to data models. That's what we often use to refer to that term. They describe processes or systems. Sometimes we use it to model and framework to refer to an outline of a tentative theoretical conceptualization. And other times models can be summaries of theories, just oversimplified versions of those theories. My theoretical point of departure for this study was based on critical realism, based on the work of English philosopher of science Roy Bhaskar. Central to critical realism is the belief that the world is, our observation of the world is theory-laden. In other words, our perception is mediated by our existing knowledge of it, the theories that we already have, past experiences. However, the nature of reality itself is theory independent. In other words, it remains independent from our thoughts and feelings about it. So theory from a critical realist perspective is understood to be a conceptualization of reality that's mediated by our prior understanding and examination of phenomena. So in short, my study was a systematic literature review coupled with in-depth theory analysis. I used a structured review guide to extract the necessary data from the articles that I reviewed. And in order to make the analysis a bit more manageable, but also more productive and interesting, I grouped the theories together into their corresponding paradigm. So theory visibility refers to how clearly the theory is being referred to and how thoroughly it is being applied in the publication. I distinguish between 4 types of theory visibility. On the one hand, we have simply absent. Of course, that is articles that simply did not mention any theory. There was just no indication at all that there was any influence of a theory in the work. Then I have implicit and explicit theory use. Now, implicit is, of course, self-evident. The theory, there was no overt mention of theory, but if you read the article, if you look at the constructs that were used, the line of argumentation, the references, you get a sense that there was the authors did draw on some school of thought, some meta theory. And so in that case, then an article would be seen as using theory implicitly. And then explicit theory use is, of course, when authors explicitly mention a theory. But as I was doing the analysis, I realized that there were authors that they explicitly mentioned a theory. They would name a theory, but they would name it in vague terms. So instead of saying the theory of planned behavior, they will say we drew upon socio-behaviorist theories, or just feminist theory, but not specifying what theory. So I decided to make a distinction between explicit but vague, and then explicit and direct. And so direct is then straightforward, directly referencing the theory that's used. Let's get into the results. This is my Prisma flowchart that summarizes the search results. 3,848 papers met my inclusion criteria. This column chart summarizes the publication trends from the 1980s to 2020. The first article that discussed the social and behavioral aspects of HIV was published in 1985. As you can see, there were not a lot of articles that focused on this topic in the 80s and 90s. And this also reflects the largely silent nature of the HIV epidemic in the 80s and 90s. So only towards the 2000s, when the magnitude of the impact of the epidemic became clearly known, that it became more of a research focus area in the country and globally. South Africa became the center for studying HIV. From all the articles that I reviewed, about half of them seemingly did not use theory. No trace of theory use could be found. The remaining half used theory. 30% of it used theory directly, explicitly, while around 6% used theory explicitly, but in vague terms, and 13% used theory, but in implicit manner. So let's look at the paradigms that were identified. As you can see, and maybe perhaps it's not a surprise, social behaviorism was the paradigm that was most often used, but closely followed by socio-ecological and systems theories and critical theory. Let's look at the trends over time. So this is a stacked column chart that demonstrates the proportional size of each paradigm per year. Note that some studies used more than one, a theory for more than one paradigm at the same time. So they would draw maybe on Freire's critical pedagogy alongside social cognitive theory, for example. So then it was seen as two paradigms being used. So that's why some of the years go beyond 100%. So as you can see, social behaviorism predominated in the 1980s and 90s, often in combination with communication and media theories, as they helped to inform awareness-raising interventions, which were particularly popular in the early years of the pandemic. It was interesting, though, that during these, while social behaviorism was still the predominant paradigm, it was interesting that they were already starting to develop some critique against social behaviorism, that some people felt that the paradigm was not ideally suited for studying HIV or for studying behavior in the South African context. A lot of the critique centered around the fact that social behaviorism focused on individual behavior change, while perhaps neglecting the lack of agency that a lot of people have, especially marginalized communities have. And they felt that social behaviorism was perhaps attracting attention away from the social nature of HIV. And so critics increasingly started to say, but we need to move towards the use of theories that is a bit more sensitive to the lived experiences of at-risk individuals and people living with HIV. We need to adopt theories that are a bit more sensitive to social context, to culture, and more socially engaged theories. And so you can see as the years go on from the 2000s, especially around the 2010s, there's definitely a shift where social behaviorism becomes a little bit less dominant. It's certainly still there, but other paradigms, particularly critical theory and socio-ecological and systems theories, started to make serious inroads into the literature. Of course, there were also far less articles in the beginning, but proportionally, you could see that there definitely was a shift taking place. It's also just interesting to note the green bar, that is the cognitive psychology and behavioral economics theories. So, of course, behavioral economics, nudging, and behavioral economic principles are becoming quite popular these days. And we're also seeing that in the South African literature here. So it appears that there is some sort of a paradigm shift underway, affecting not only how we study social and behavioral aspects of HIV, but how globally how we study human behavior and society at large. These shifts seem to center around focusing, shifting the focus from the individual to the individual in context, shifting the focus from reflective psychological processes to structural processes, to more reaction-based conceptualizations of human behavior. I think it's important to reflect on these shifts in perspective. What do we gain? What do we lose? Perhaps that's something we can discuss later in the Q&A. As I was reviewing the articles, there were a few things that stood out, and I don't have a lot of time, but in the last couple of minutes of my presentation, I would like to make you attentive on the following few specific issues that I felt is worth mentioning. It was quite remarkable, but perhaps not surprising, how rare theory testing was in the literature. Out of the 3,000 plus articles that I reviewed, only 37 of them explicitly and directly tested a theory. All of them tested social behaviorist theories, especially the theory of planned behavior. That was by far the most popular one. Test of behavioral intent was most common. Test of actual behavior to see if change really happened was less common. So this is also not uncommon of a lot of tests of theory of planned behavior, but it was interesting that behavioral intent is tested, but the actual behavior change is not necessarily always part of the analysis. And similarly, there's a lot of reliance on self-report data, which of course is understandable, but there's a limited use of objective measures of behavior change, like testing for STIs and so on, to see if behavior had actually changed, or use it as a proxy for behavior change. Another thing that was quite striking was how emergent causation was underutilized. A lot of studies seemed to default to the assumption that there was linear causality, one-directional causality, even if they used theories that actually assume bidirectional emergent causation. For example, in the case of social behaviorism, it assumes bidirectional and emergent causation between the person, behavior, their beliefs, and the environment, yet that isn't necessarily always evident when you read studies based on those theories. Now, of course, a lot of summaries of these theories might not really emphasize that fact, and certainly diagrams that summarize these theories, like the one I'm presenting on the screen now, the most recent iteration of the theory of planned behavior, doesn't necessarily pertinently demonstrate that feedback, that bidirectional causality that is actually part of this theory. And so people mistakenly assume linear causality. Similarly, there's also a neglect of dynamic determinism. So all the paradigms, the prominent paradigms that I mentioned, social behaviorism, critical theory, and socio-ecological and systems theory, they all espouse some degree of dynamic interplay between upward and downward causation. Yet, a lot of the studies defaulted to one or the other. Society is influencing the individual, or it's just individual. This, of course, demonstrates a bigger, larger challenge in the way we study social behavior, and that's that tension between structure and agency. And certainly it was visible in the literature. And then lastly, it was also interesting to know that there were a misconstrued understanding of some theories, and it was pervasive in the literature. A good example of that is the way social behaviorism was used and critiqued. So typically social behaviorism and social behaviorist theories were criticized for three things. Firstly, that it's based on the assumption that improved knowledge will result in improved changed behavior. Knowledge equals behavior. And this is obviously a oversimplification of the theory. The theories typically make affordances for more mediating variables between knowledge and actual behavior. It's been well accepted that a knowledge on its own is not going to change behavior. Yet sometimes studies essentially imply that in the way they use the theory, or it seems like they expect that. So it also signifies a non-sophisticated way of using the theory then. Another critique that was often labeled as social behaviorism was that it assumes that people think and behave rationally at all times. That's also not true. Social behaviorism assumes that people create their own understanding of their reality, and they make decisions based on their perception of reality, not reality itself. And lastly, social behaviorism is sometimes criticized for disregarding the complexity of human behavior and the social mechanisms that are at play. And again, I mean, if you look at social cognitive theory, it definitely makes allowance for this nature of individual behavior and the interaction between peers. So what this really demonstrates is that a lot of the critique is more so critique of how the theory is used than the theory itself, what it really assumes, what it really maintains. And this sort of reinforces my position that we really need to pay closer attention to how we use theory, and we need to study theory use more closely. The inaccurate, vague, and unsophisticated use of theory obviously attracts critique about theory, which is understandable because it does produce unhelpful, shallow, low quality research. Problem is that critique perpetuates the misunderstanding and the shallow understanding of the theory. And instead of improving theories, we end up perpetuating the misuse and misconstrued understanding thereof. So what are the implications of this? What does this mean for our research? So most definitely we need to take better care of how we refer to theory in the literature, naming it explicitly, also making more of an effort to explain in detail how we used it, how it was utilized, how theoretical constructs were linked to intervention techniques and study variables. We also most certainly need to test theories more. And then lastly, we need to recognize the limitations of our theories, and we need to be skeptical of them and the assumptions that they're based on. Like Karl Popper says, if we are uncritical, we will always find what we want to see. And if we remain uncritical, we will also not see that which we don't want to see, that which makes us feel uncomfortable and that threatens our beloved theories and opinions. So in conclusion, this review of the South African literature demonstrated that around half of the papers did not use theory in any way that could be ascertained from reading the papers. The remaining half, about 19%, used theory implicitly or vaguely, and 30% used it directly and explicitly. Social behaviorism was the most prominent paradigm, followed closely by critical theory and the socio-ecological and systems paradigm, where use of theory, vague naming of theories, limited theory testing, the underutilization of emergence and dynamic determinism, and pervasive misperceptions about theories are common, and they threaten a more deeper understanding of our subject matter. In order for us to make scientific progress in the social behavioral study of HIV, it's critical that we make more sophisticated use of theories. And with that, I close my presentation and would like to hear more from you and what you think about theory use in our field.
Thank you so much, Marinda. That was really so well thought out and well laid out, and I think so useful to us in so many ways. As
Thank you very
I'm
much.
going to ask a question in a minute, but just to remind everyone, feel free to you can place a question in the chat, but also just raise your hand and we'll unmute you so that you can ask your question and participate in the discussion. Sort of having trouble articulating the comment and question I'm going to make, and so it's a little complicated in terms of. But part of what's useful about this, or what, of course, as researchers, it makes me think of, is how we conceptualize, how we think about and develop our studies, but then how we write our grants and our grant proposals, and how they're going to be reviewed. Given everything that you've said and the appropriate use of theories and the clarity around use of theoretical frameworks, but also how you use them, how you utilize them in the study, how you measure them. So Mike, I'm going to ask a sort of a broad question that you can comment on, and maybe other people may want to comment on, is how do we balance, especially towards the end when you talked about the emergent causation and dynamic determination, like in the real world, there's so many things that influence other things, and it's not just it's multi-directional, right? And there are feedback loops. And so I feel like I struggle with the balance of thinking of everything, especially if you're doing an intervention, thinking of everything that might influence behavior change at all levels, societal, community, individual, interpersonal. And then there's the question of, okay, you might refer to all these influences, but are you actually measuring them all? And can you even measure them all? Are you going to hypothesize, actual, connections between all? I guess what I'm asking is, in your opinion, how useful is it to contextualize our studies and our interventions in terms of all the potential influencers, to contextualize it that way, but in reality, in a limited sample size and a limited budget, you can't measure everything that you're making reference to. So what's your thoughts about when someone describes their framework and all the things that could influence something, when we are limited pragmatically by sample size and ability to measure, when we can't actually necessarily measure everything that might be influencing that behavior change? It's kind of a vague question, but any thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, boy, it is obviously a massive challenge. I cannot say I have a good answer to that. I think there's obviously a lot of methodological hindrances that just makes it impossible to really capture all of that in one study, certainly. So I suppose perhaps meta-analyses and reviews of the literature might help us to bring that contextualization to help us understand how things fit together. At least that, as things stand now, that is the most useful thing we have now. Yeah, because studies that try to, if you study too much, if you try and do too much, you end up doing nothing at all. You go 5 miles wide and an inch deep. So you have that challenge as well. You don't want to do shallow research. So yeah, I think it's a challenge. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I may comment further, but I see Bryan has his hand raised. Bryan, do you want to go ahead?
I think Fran was before me, since I've got the floor later. Let's hear from Fran first, I think.
Thank you for noticing that. Fran, you want to go?
Sorry. First of all, I just want to say I found your talk absolutely fascinating. And I think it makes a great contribution. I don't see my picture, but I hope that doesn't matter.
We can hear you.
Yeah. So anyway, what I was going to make a comment is that, I trained originally when I was in college in chemistry, and I thought about getting a PhD in chemistry. And one of the things it's given me a perspective about is the attitude of towards theory that's much more religious among psychologists than it is among people who do things like physics and chemistry. And that's always fascinated me because in physics and chemistry, we want to disprove theory and we think that's fun. Whereas it seems to me in a lot of the psychological theories, nobody thinks that's fun. People worry it might be an insult to the people who created the theory. So one remedy could be a better blend in how the rest of science is conducted, learning more about how do you tolerate theory as just a guess, as the best true. And what's the fun of trying to disprove it? Because a lot of the most important things ever discovered came from disproving something rather than proving something. So I don't know if there could be an attitude change. I think that would go a long way.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for that comment. That is so insightful. Bringing that perspective of physics together with psychology, it's not often done. And yeah, I had to chuckle there because it was very funny. It's very true that there is people take it very personally. I don't know, it's because of we're studying social behavior, we're studying ourselves. Maybe it's just something that's more it's more personal, I guess. I think I would definitely recommend that people are, if they can simply just be more skeptical of what they believe, of their own assumptions. If they're willing to, shall we say, create a deeper bookshelf for themselves, where they're not just reading the stuff that they are interested in, but they're reading maybe about things that are that they don't believe in, maybe just to expand their worldview a bit. I think broadening one's view could actually also help to cultivate that skepticism. It might help contribute to what you were talking about.
Yeah, just with this one last comment, which is skepticism can be taught to be fun. See, we don't think it's fun, but in physics and chemistry, it's fun. Yeah. So making skepticism fun would go a long way to motivating people to be skeptical.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's it.
Interesting.
Thank you very much.
Bryan, your turn, I believe.
Thanks, Bob. That was a really interesting talk. In the spirit of being skeptical about my own work, borrowing from Fran, we use, I'll talk about this later when I give my presentation, but we use the trans-theoretical approach. And I'm just curious, in this very large effort that you made to understand theory and how it's been applied, what do you think about using trans-theoretical approaches? In our case, we use the Cohen-B model, which is based on 33 other theories as a way of trying to consolidate and communicate across theory. I'm just curious what you think about those approaches.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, yeah, the focus sort of, if I understand it correctly, the focus sort of shifts more to the construct level. You're focusing on those constructs. And I can totally understand the usefulness of that. Especially it makes it so much more easy to study. But one thing that I am a little bit worried about is that, remember, I assume a lot of these theories are essentially based on social behaviorism. Yeah, so I suppose then they do have, at least they are ontologically and epistemologically aligned in terms of their assumptions, their underlying assumptions, because the problem comes in when you're combining things that may not be, yeah, commensurable. But yeah, and but I wonder if the work you're doing on those constructs, does it change the theories that those constructs come from in any way? Do you think that will help to then test theories and elaborate on those theories more?
I think as we'll see with their systematic review, I think we're not positing so much relationships between the constructs. In some ways we are, but we're not trying to create like a larger theory ourselves. We're trying to just articulate how people have used theory in not too dissimilar a way to the way that you've done it. But I've also tried to use these trans-theoretical approaches like the Cohen-B model when conducting research and not doing just a systematic review. And one of the criticisms is sort of lose some of the specificity of theory that isn't trans-theoretical. I worry myself, just being skeptical about this approach, that I have then a shallow understanding of these other theories. I may have a deep understanding of how to, operationalize some of the constructs in the trans-theoretical approach, but then my knowledge of these other things becomes more shallow.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. It's good that you think about it like that. So we're not getting stuck in one way of thinking there, and realizing the limitations of that approach.
Great discussion. There's a comment and a question in the Q&A I'm going to go to now, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. So Charles Gonzalez made a comment after Fran was talking about physics. He says, not a question, but physics has the advantage of having a second language, mathematics. I don't know if you want to comment, Miranda, but that's very astute, Charles, as you always are. Heino has a question. We also need to take into account the balance between complex theories and actionable aspects. I think this is similar to what I was talking about. Limited resources for intervention requires a focus on mechanisms that permit intervention actions given limited resources. So it's framed as a statement, but maybe you can comment, Miranda, before we move on.
Yeah, well, the comment makes me think about something that that was also interesting in my review of the literature, is that there's clearly a difference between theories that serve to describe behavior and those that inform actual implementation and action and prediction. And sometimes a theory can be really good at describing something, but not good at predicting it. And we've seen this in various contexts in HIV as well. I mean, if Heino wants to ask something else or elaborate on what he said, it would be interesting to hear what he has to say. There's some time. Yeah,
if you want to, Heino, but we will have to move on. I guess my comment is trying to pull together what you just said and what Heino is saying, and thinking about what I asked earlier. Is I've seen well, I mean, again, my head's in sort of grants and reviews and how people propose and think about their studies. I've seen successful ways of people articulating the multiple influences that are, more than one can intervene upon. However, for empirical reasons and based on prior literature and determinant studies, to say we are going to focus on these, what we believe to be the most salient features that we actually can intervene upon. It's a little bit like what's changeable, what's not changeable. If we can't change the broader influencers, we can acknowledge and maybe think about how they might be influencing what we're doing, but we're zeroing in on something that we feel are actionable and we can change. And so that's my point about like maybe laying out a broader framework, but then articulating a specific theory that it's almost like you're putting your money on, you're betting on those factors that you think are salient in a specific population, right, in a specific setting,
Yes, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I've definitely seen articles that specifically say that, we choose these variables because those are the ones that are changeable. Yes. Sure, personality style, there's other things that also play a role, but we can't really change them. They're not really reachable. So we focus on the things that we can.
Great. Well, again, thank you. We're right at the time where we need to shift over to Bryan. So we really appreciate this very thoughtful presentation. I'm glad to know you'll be meeting with our postdoctoral research fellows to talk more about this. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone's question.
Okay. So now on to Bryan. And let me just, sorry about that. Now I'm losing my way here. Okay, so Bryan Kutner, known to many of us since he is a recent faculty member here in our institution, in our HIV center. However, he has just recently moved on. He is now, he's a clinical psychologist and has training in epidemiology, but he's now an assistant professor at PRIME, which stands for the Psychiatry Research Institute at Montefiore Medical Center and Einstein College of Medicine. So he's not far away from us, and he's still a colleague with many of us. He is also a former, besides being a faculty member of the HIV Center, he's an alumnus of our T32 fellowship program. Bryan studies implementation strategies to mitigate HIV-related stigma in healthcare settings to improve HIV service quality and engagement. He is particularly interested in expediting implementation and dissemination of mitigation strategies by elucidating their theory-based functions, apropos what we just talked about, component techniques and mechanisms of action. He has worked for over 2 decades in the harm reduction movement, training frontline HIV service workers in evidence-based strategies like motivational interviewing, and he has been actually a member of the motivational interviewing network of trainers since 2011. So he's talking with us today about applying ontologies from the behavior change wheel to identify and develop the theoretical basis of strategies that mitigate HIV-related stigma in healthcare settings. Over to you, Bryan.
Thanks, Bob. So that was a very nice setup for Marinda for this discussion. So there's a lot on this page, and a lot in that title that Bob just said, but it all boils down to trying to understand the theoretical basis of strategies that actually reduce or mitigate stigma. So that's what we're going to focus on. A bit of a land acknowledgement first, just to acknowledge the land politically designated as New York City to be the homeland of the Lenape people who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. This project that I'm about to describe was funded by an NIH supplement that Bob and Theo received, and it was to build a coalition to overcome intersecting stigmas in New York City. So that also, I'll go over the goal of that project, in particular this compendium, which resulted in a systematic review and then some discussion questions. But our main question for this, one component of this coalition, was to try to understand what's the evidence that intervention strategies can reduce HIV-related stigma among healthcare workers and healthcare systems in the United States. This was a really big effort involving all the people that you're seeing listed here, some of whom are here. You know, Fran is here, and Karen, Daria, Rebecca, Christina, Karen, Justin, Theo himself as well. People from a lot of different organizations contributed to this project over the course of a couple of years. So just by way of background, one of the issues with stigma and stigma reduction is stigma is a very pervasive and longstanding barrier to accessing HIV-related services, and therefore also to ending the epidemic. And the efforts that people have made to mitigate stigma really vary widely. And that makes it really difficult to try to synthesize effects across studies because the approaches vary so much, and sometimes people don't articulate the theory, to Marinda's point, so clearly enough that we can actually compare across studies. So what we need when it comes to stigma reduction is a theoretical understanding across studies. And that requires some formal explicit definitions of constructs and their interrelations. And that is in itself a definition of what an ontology is, at least my understanding of it. And if we can do that, then we'll be able to accelerate our understanding across those contexts and then expedite implementation of stigma reduction strategies that we think would be effective. So that's the background of why we wanted to ask that question in the first place. And originally with this coalition, this compendium project was intended to create some sort of menu of options to reduce HIV-related stigma that a healthcare setting could then choose from and implement. And here you see me with my high ponytail riding my bike thinking I'm getting to the end. But actually, the whole team was on this ride together and there were a lot of obstacles. And what we ended up with was more of a spreadsheet that characterizes the intervention types, techniques, and mechanisms that were applied in different studies. So that's kind of jargony. People may not really know what I mean when I say intervention types, techniques, and mechanisms that reduce stigma. So this is the main kind of argument for trying to articulate that if we can characterize the theory behind strategies to reduce stigma, these intervention types, techniques, and mechanisms, which I'll define in a moment, then we may be able to expand the benefits of efforts in a single study if we understand the theoretical basis to other settings where stigma reduction is needed. So to try to articulate what I mean by intervention types, techniques, and mechanisms, if you overheard a colleague misgendering someone in a healthcare setting, you're sort of faced with the question of what do you do in that situation? So you could ask yourself, what's the general approach that you think is going to work? And one of those approaches might be modeling how to be with that client. And this is a function of your intervention. It's a type of general approach underlying what you'll do. But then there are specific ingredients within modeling. So the question is, what will you actually do to change this healthcare worker or colleague's behavior? One of the things that you might do is demonstrate language to use when talking about clients. And that's a specific technique that you're going to use to support the general approach of modeling. And then what do you think actually is going to shift as a result of your introducing some demonstration of how to talk about clients? You might posit that knowledge, awareness, motivation, those things might change in the short term. And those we can characterize as mechanisms that you're aiming to shift right now. So that's what I mean when I say intervention types, a type of general approach, techniques, the specific techniques that are being used, and then mechanisms of action are the things that you think are shifting in the short term. This is based on a set of ontologies from the behavior change wheel, which I'll describe a little bit more, but the definition of an ontology, at least in this consensus report, is it's a formal, explicit definition of theoretical constructs and also the way that these constructs relate to one another. And that's particularly helpful given how varied stigma interventions are in the field. The behavior change wheel, and I realize this is a lot to throw at you because visually, when I first saw this, I was quite overwhelmed. The behavior change wheel is an ontology that starts with behavior at the center and is based on a model called the capability opportunity motivation model, the COMB. So capability, opportunity, motivation lead to behavior. And then over here in this next ring, what you'll see are mechanisms of action, knowledge, attention, skills, things that change in the short term, and then result in whatever change it is that you're ultimately trying to target. In my case, trying to improve engagement and retention in HIV services. And then in this green ring, what you see are intervention types, like where's modeling? Modeling is here, providing an example for people to aspire to or imitate. So, and then the outer ring is about policy, which I won't touch for the moment. But the idea here is that there are relationships between these different levels. And the behavior change wheel is an ontology that has looked at the evidence and expert opinion to try to articulate what are the relationships between these different intervention types, techniques, and mechanisms based on science. So I'm just going to introduce a little bit about the COMB model because it is helpful. It's based on the prime theory, but the idea is that capability, motivation, and opportunity lead to behavior. And if you take a simple example of learning to ride a bicycle, if I want to have the behavior of riding a bicycle, I have to have the capability of riding a bicycle. I also have to have the motivation, I want to do it. And then also I need an actual bicycle in order to be able to emit that behavior. And of course, these different constructs are interrelated with one another as well. And then they're also broken down a little bit more. So it's not just that I have the physical opportunity of an actual bicycle, but I also may need the social opportunity of someone who's going to show me how to get on the bicycle and is going to support me as I try to learn how to ride a bike. This just articulates some of these constructs in a little bit more detail. So I'll pass that for now, but it'll be available later if people want to look at it some more. What's really interesting to me, or was compelling to me and fed into this systematic review, is that the behavior change wheel has done a really interesting job of articulating different constructs in a way that allows us to then look at literature and operationalize what people have done in the literature into the terms of underlying theory. So here's one way that this is done. The behavior change taxonomy online is this self-guided approach to understanding the different techniques that go into an intervention. So just to show you what this looks like, this is me now demonstrating the behavior a bit. It's an online platform, and it will help you learn 93 different behavior change techniques, which are kind of posited to be the periodic table of behavior change, like the smallest possible elemental component of a strategy. And in order to be able to understand that, this platform has taken excerpts from published literature and then allows you to code and understand which behavior change technique do you think is being described here. And so we use that approach in our systematic review. Rebecca, who's here, and I, and also Farnaz, who is also on the systematic review, went through that course and then went through a process of coding literature to try to articulate what are the techniques that people use to reduce stigma. There's also a relationship between behavior change techniques and mechanisms of action. So behavior change techniques are the smallest possible ingredient that you would introduce to change behavior, but they are intended to have an effect on a mechanism of action. And the theory and techniques tool, which is also based on the behavior change wheel, is a heat map that articulates here in the left-hand column different behavior change techniques, the smallest possible component of a behavior change strategy, and then relationships with different mechanisms of action that are in this top row as columns. So I'll show you what this looks like. Oops, I'll show you what that looks like here. So let's go down here to demonstration of behavior. And here we go. Here's demonstration of behavior. This platform will define for you what that is. And then if you click here, you'll be able to see, based on evidence and expert opinion, whether there are links between this behavior change technique and specific mechanisms of action. In this case, beliefs about capabilities and social learning and imitation are the ones where there are established links. This is not like a be-all end-all of what links behavior change techniques with mechanisms of action, but it's a really interesting way to try to articulate the relationship between these different constructs, and it's a work in progress that we can always contribute to. So the idea with our systematic review is there a way that we can look at the literature about stigma mitigation and articulate intervention types, specific behavior change techniques that were used, and mechanisms of action, in the effort of hopefully one day being able to articulate something like what you're seeing on the screen today, which is these relationships between these different constructs. So I'm going to get into the compendium a bit. Marinda, when I saw the number of records that you identified, I thought that we had a lot of records, but you had even more. We looked across 5 databases, and we found 21,000 records. Ultimately, 28 made it into the review. So we refer to that as the needle in the haystack, because 0.13% of records were ones that we actually included. And just to give you a sense of a little bit of what we found, and then I'll get into the potential effectiveness of these different intervention types and techniques and mechanisms of action. One thing you'll notice is that in terms of the study participants, there were only 2 health systems that were studied, and only 2 studies involved medical doctors, and only 3 involved administrators. So if we sort of look at the social ecological theory that Marinda mentioned in passing earlier, there's not a lot of involvement of people with relative power in a healthcare system. Most of what's done seems to be among paraprofessionals and other kinds of staff and students. And of course, also sometimes studies didn't really specify what their sample, who was in their sample. And then in terms of stigmatized attributes that were studied, we were not looking just at HIV stigma, we were looking at HIV-related stigma. And the reason we did that is because we know that forces like racism and sexism, transphobia, heterosexism influence stigma in healthcare settings. And that's where stigma gets manifested as a result of those forces. So we wanted to look at a lot of different kinds of attributes that our compendium team thought would be related to HIV stigma. And you'll see about a quarter of them looked at multiple attributes. Multiple stigmatized attributes is not really it's not really intersectional, but it's one way of trying to understand whether these studies did look at anything intersectionally. Only one study looked at intersectional HIV stigma, and then you can see these other combinations of stigmatized attributes. And then there's a lot of variability in terms of the study designs. Of the 28 studies, only 9 of them, about a third of them, used an experimental design. And that's important in terms of the quality of the studies, but also in terms of our ability to look at potential effectiveness, which I'll describe next. So when I talk about potential effectiveness, we're really looking at what we think is the best evidence that these intervention types, behavior change techniques, and mechanisms of action are associated with some sort of reduction or mitigation of HIV-related stigma. So let's take a look at intervention types. And again, these are the different approaches to reduce stigma. And as they're articulated through the behavior change wheel ontology, you'll see education, training, persuasion, modeling. And persuasion is it's a tricky one because people think it's about sort of manipulation, but it's not. It's about, sorry, I'll explain this in a moment. I thought this slide was going to be a different one. But as an example, education is about increasing knowledge or understanding to reduce stigma. Training is about increasing skill to reduce stigma. And persuasion is about using communication strategies to influence positive or negative emotions and also action. So what you see here is that 100% of the studies used education as an intervention type, at least as the way that we coded them. And you'll see a little bit more than half used training to increase skills, about 40% used persuasion. And we defined potential effectiveness as the ratio of the number of studies that had a positive effect reported out of the number of studies that actually used that particular intervention type. So what you can start to see is that even though 100% of the studies used education, the potential effectiveness of education was only about 80%. Now, this is in all of the studies, and the studies really varied in their quality. So if we then look at the studies that used an experimental design, just as a measure of a more robust approach to evaluating causality, what you see is that education has a 44% potential effectiveness. What you also see is that persuasion, even though only 39% of the studies used persuasion, according to our coding, 67% of the studies that had an experimental design demonstrated some potential effectiveness. And that is higher than just education. So this is a way of trying to look at the relative effects of these different intervention types. And we did the same thing when it came to behavior change techniques and also mechanisms of action. So I'll just show you a bit of that here. We've got the techniques here. We've got, are they present in these 28 studies? But then we also got the potential effectiveness to try to get a relative effectiveness between these different techniques. And then same thing with mechanisms of action. So we've already, I think I've hammered this home already, that we're looking at intervention types and techniques and mechanisms. And the overall findings were that interventions may be most effective when they go beyond just providing information. So more than just education, and also more than just training. So not just skills building, to apply persuasion, which is that communication strategies intended to induce positive or negative emotions. And also by using these particular techniques, behavior change techniques, the smallest possible ingredients: credible sources, delivering the content, time for skills practice, reframing people's thinking, support for addressing emotions, and information on the consequences of stigma. And then, attempting to increase healthcare workers' belief in their capacity and intentions to address stigma. So these are all color-coded. So what's in orange are about intervention types, blue about techniques, and yellow is about mechanisms of action. What we ended up with was this spreadsheet rather than sort of a menu. And what I'd like to do is just show you a bit of that, because our publication was just accepted, and our hope is that this will be a supplemental file so that people can use it. It's got a little instruction tab to begin with. But what you see here are each study on the left-hand column. And then when we look at intervention types, you can then see which studies used which intervention type. And likewise, behavior change techniques, as well as over here, mechanisms of action. So for example, if you've got a theoretical understanding that you think that emotion is something that you should be targeting as a mechanism of action, what you can do here is you can select for that and then see all the studies that have measured emotion, at least as the way that we were able to code them, and then also look and see what kinds of techniques did they also use. And you can see that all articulated here, as well as which kinds of intervention types they used. And if you have a question about how we coded things, there's also a code book in which we took each of these components, intervention types, behavior change techniques, and mechanisms of action. And then we've got the definitions here and then excerpts from our coding so that you can see how we coded them. And the hope here again is to try to accelerate the process of understanding the theory behind stigma mitigation strategies in order to accelerate the application of those strategies in different contexts. So lots of limitations with this approach. We used an ontology. Studies did not use the same ontology. So they were using theory, and to Marinda's point, only 54% of studies actually referred to a theory. And then talking about the vagueness of the application of theory, some subset of those were more vague. I think we could go back and use that categorization approach that Marinda used to understand that a little bit more. Studies also rarely wholly wrote what it is that they actually implemented. So with our ontology, we coded yes or no. Also, we didn't code the dosage of each construct, so we don't know about that. And then each strategy also involved lots of different techniques, but we were looking at singular constructs. So think of this like, if behavior change techniques are the smallest possible component that you can introduce to change behavior, then that's like an element. But molecules, strategies, are made up of lots of different elements or combinations of those things. And one way to just show you this is in this table from our manuscript. You can see in this study, for example, they didn't just use education, they used education and training. And in this study, they also added enablement. In other studies, they added several other intervention types. And then you can see these different combinations of behavior change techniques and mechanisms of action as well. So what we really should be looking at are comparing studies that are alike, that use the same intervention types, the same set of techniques, the same set of mechanisms of action, so that then we can try to understand which combinations are effective. But our method was much more limited because we were just looking at singular constructs. So the combinations really need to be explored in order to understand what does and doesn't reduce stigma from those combinations. And then, of course, we're looking at potential effectiveness. It's not effectiveness. It's a fairly crude way of looking at effectiveness, but at least it demonstrates an approach. And then also the process of techniques isn't really captured with these this particular ontology. So, if a manuscript described that the exercises were interactive or was dynamic, we didn't have any way of coding that. The ERIC implementation science framework does have something now that could be used to apply that kind of analysis. Some references, I'm just going to highlight the first one here because it's in press. This is our systematic review, hopefully coming out soon. And then some resources, the Human Behavior Change Project. These are the folks who developed the Behavior Change Wheel, the Behavior Change Techniques Taxonomy, the Theory and Techniques tool, which is that heat map. And they are in the process of finalizing some more ontological tools that are in development, specifically articulating a little bit more about mechanisms of action. And then I will also make a plug for the HIV Center's collaboration with the Science of Behavior Change program in this 3-part series about why behavioral interventions work or don't work. All those recordings are available. And I will also highlight that the Human Behavior Change Project, the folks who developed the Behavior Change Wheel, were the highlight of the first seminar. So you can learn more about them through that. Again, just want to thank the entire team, lots of effort over the course of several years. And I will leave it at that.